Chapter 11. Houses of Parliament. Monday the 28th of May, 2463. He stands alongside the other giants, Newton, Da Vinci, Edison, Darwin, and Einstein, the greatest of men. Obituary for Sanjay Dutt, New York Times, 2075. James kicked open the door to his workshop, carrying both the case and his toolbox. It had once been the members' smoking room. This corridor had been lined with the Commons Library, offices, and the members' tea rooms. Now they were the storerooms in which were crammed some of the thousands of items which had been recovered over the past dozen years. Across the corridor were the squat toilets, and in this summer heat their gagging stench would waft up the passageway. Someone should do something about it, he thought. The doctor doesn't give a sod. The Den was the name given to his workshop. It was sizable, with a long workbench and 3 wide desks. The bench and desks were cluttered with screens and cardboard boxes, from which spilled cords which drooped from the tables and swirled like spaghetti across the dirty carpet. A saucepan stood on top of a pile of manuals under a brown stain in the ceiling. "Ah, shit," he cursed, stumbling over a large yellow battery, one of half a dozen littering the floor. He heard a rustling. Looking up, he saw a crow, its wings half outstretched, sitting alarmed on the top of a shelf. "Oh, shit," he cursed again. "How the hell did that get in here?" The bird seemed larger among the books and manuals, and must have come through one of the open windows. With half an eye on the bird, he began making some space among the debris on his workbench. He moved 3 unwashed mugs, one with soup stains, plus some papers onto another pile, and then opened the rest of the windows as wide as they could go. Perhaps the creature would have the sense to fly out without knocking over his stuff and crapping on his kit. Trying to ignore its scraping, James sat down and opened the case, carefully taking out the Apple snaz. Next he opened the top drawer of his workbench where he kept his leather tobacco pouch. While holding the shiny black snaz in one hand, he rolled himself a thin cigarette with the other. "This really is something special," he thought. "A limited edition model." Its lines were clean, its shape sensuous. It fitted snugly into his palm. He knew that when it was powered up, its plastic was pliable and could scrunch up into his pocket, yet spring back into shape later. It would of course contain a treasure trove of information. He had only respect for the engineers who had once designed it. Why the hell can't we make anything like this now? This was the question he always asked himself when he came across something he admired from the 21st century. But it was a rhetorical question. He already knew the answer. The doctor's explanation was probably the best. He called it the end of progress. In the turmoil of the 22nd and 23rd centuries, poverty and conflict had shrunk the world's population from 12 billion to 1.5 billion. People abandoned their education, trades, and specializations, and instead were more concerned about defending themselves and feeding their families. In less than 3 generations, much of the world had reverted to a peasant and barter economy. Since then, it had barely recovered. What James found frustrating was not that the knowledge of the 21st century, the golden age, had been lost. It was all around, particularly in London. It was just that the dynamics did not yet exist to return to a standard of civilization comparable to that era. Leaning back, he lit the cigarette and, inhaling deeply, blew the smoke into the shafts of sunlight that poured through the unwashed windows. His thumb felt a button on the snaz. He looked at it. It was the on-off button, and he pressed it. It momentarily illuminated and bleeped before dying. "Oh, bloody amazing," he gasped aloud, astonished that after all these centuries there was still a drop of power in it. Switching on his desk lamp, he taped the snaz beneath it. As it had bleeped, there was, he guessed, a good chance the battery inside might still be functional. If so, it would take a couple of hours to fully recharge. As chief technician, he refurbished and maintained some of the electronic equipment recovered in London. Most of the pieces he handled had been damaged by the radiation in some way. Invariably, he had to cannibalize parts from different units to get one working again. As a sideline, he took orders for refurbs from a contact on the outside, who paid twice the going rate. He had to be careful, though. Couldn't afford to get caught. Glancing up at the fidgeting crow, he drew on his cigarette, formed his lips into a circle and jabbed a smoke ring at it, watching it roll and curl across the room. The crow shuffled nervously 2 steps sideways as it approached. A thin smile of satisfaction traced on his face. He liked his job and considered himself as fortunate. He was reasonably paid, and the food was adequate, although he felt bitter about the condescending them and us attitude the doctor had. He and Guppy Gupta dined far better, eating meat almost daily. Echoing down the corridor, a woman's footsteps could be heard coming closer. It was Bea. He wanted to have a word with her before the delegation arrived. He pinched the end of the cigarette and got up. As he did so, a screen, which had stood idle for years in Beijing, awoke.